Going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Carson McPherson-Krutzke, and I'm a research associate with the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. I am so happy to welcome you to the Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible through support from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as the National Science Foundation. This webinar series was launched in 2019, and it highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. I want to share a few announcements before we begin. The forum is being recorded, and the captioned video recording and presentation slides will be available online at the Natural Hazard Center website at hazards.colorado.edu after the webinar. This is also the location where you can find recordings and supplemental materials from prior Making Mitigation Work webinars and gain access to other free resources. So please do go ahead and check out these links after our meeting today if you want to. In a few moments, I'm going to turn the controls over to our speaker, but if at any point during the presentation you have a question or a comment, please feel free to submit those through the chat or the Q&A box. I will be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and we will have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to ask questions of our speaker today. So please feel free to do that. We love seeing questions in the chat. Thanks to our partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, or IAEM, attending this webinar makes you eligible to receive 1 contact hour of emergency management training. To receive this credit, you are required to attend the full session today, but if you fulfill that requirement, you can go ahead and email us at hazcenter@colorado.edu to request a certificate. You can also visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under our trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information on how to get continuing education credits. Now, I am excited to introduce today's webinar, which is titled Rethinking Housing Resilience, Lessons from Post-Disaster Research and a Way Forward. Today, we're going to be hearing from Tracy Kajewski-Correa, who will share insights from the Structural Engineering Extreme Events Reconnaissance Network, or STEER, and their efforts examining years of post-disaster observations on the resiliency of homes to climate hazards. In this presentation, you are going to learn about factors that are shaping housing resilience and how we may need to shift some of those efforts in the future to be more resilient to some of these compounding hazards and threats. It is now my pleasure to introduce Tracy Kajewski-Correa, who is the William J. Pulte Director of the Pulte Institute for Global Development at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. As a professor of civil engineering and global affairs, her research seeks to enhance the resilience and sustainability of hazard-exposed communities. She is the inaugural director of the Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance Network, STEER, whose vision is to build societal resilience by generating new knowledge on the performance of the built environment through impactful post-disaster reconnaissance disseminated to affected communities. All right, I'm going ahead and stop sharing and turn it over to Tracy.
All right, thank you so much, Carson. Let me just get this dialed up and hopefully we'll have a fairly seamless transition to my screen. Let me adjust it for my slides proportions and we should be good to go.
Yep.
So thank you everyone for spending some time here today to talk about the rising toll of disaster and particularly the effects it's having on the housing sector. So we're going to be looking at some of the factors that's driving, that are driving these trends, but I'm also bringing to this conversation my perspective as an engineer who works in these disaster responses through our network of STEER. And really what the experience that we've had as an organization these last few years in arriving on days like this, Hurricane Michael 2018, our teams arrive on the worst day of a family's life. And in that moment, we're looking for bright spots. Some of the bright spots are this, classical photo that you could see there. But more often we're sifting through destruction. And so our work centers and my individual research and the work of the STEER network on trying to make sure we can get to the day that there are many more houses standing on beaches like this after major storm events. But what we found as an organization is we just seem to get busier and busier every year. And our society is straining under the growing burden of disaster. So I wanted to begin the first part of this webinar just reflecting on how we got here. I think 2020 was an important year in understanding how we got here because it marked a new chapter in our country's history where we started talking about the billion-dollar disaster. And in that particular year of 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, we achieved, sadly, a $95 billion loss total as a result of these weather and climate-related hazards. These billion-dollar events each themselves cost at least $1 billion to a community, but there are many other consequences that are associated with that that aren't captured in those dollar amounts. What this map did was start an important dialogue in our country about billion-dollar disasters, but it had, in my opinion, an unintended consequence. Because for many communities, it doesn't take a billion-dollar disaster to set them back generationally. And that's unfortunately what we would see in many communities, particularly across the Gulf Coast, where you didn't even have a federal disaster declaration, nevertheless $1 billion loss total, but you had these compounding effects of disasters that started most markedly in this year. So you'll notice the concentration of these discrete events, particularly in the southeastern United States, and that's going to be a place where we'll spend a lot of our time today. Now, that map, while famously elevating the concept of the billion-dollar disaster and bring it into the public discourse, it omitted an important detail, and that is the time evolution of this phenomenon. And so this companion chart that I think is a helpful accompaniment, also from NOAA, shows the rising toll of these billion-dollar disasters since 1980, and looking at the number of billion-dollar disasters that have occurred over time. You can see, again, these are all driven by weather events, but what I often find striking is we immediately think of things like hurricanes, where instead you see in the dark blue there, a vast majority of these losses and these billion-dollar events are actually being accumulated through these severe storm events that are propagating across our country well outside of coastal areas. So what we can see from this chart is the rising trend and toll of disaster really starting to hit this almost exponential peak as we move post 2020, following that landmark year. So when we try to unpack what's happening here, I think a lot of rightful focus goes to the issue of climate change. And certainly attribution studies are helping us understand the role of climate in these mounting losses. We are, for example, seeing more hurricanes making landfall in some of the more recent years, which could be explaining some of these upticks. We also know that the storms are starting to change in their patterns of behavior. So we've seen since 1980 a higher frequency of landfalling hurricanes. We've seen changes in their intensification, both in terms of certain hazards being intensified, such as heavy rainfall, and certainly Helene has made that an important consideration, renewed yet again, as Harvey did in the past. But we're also seeing storms changing in their speed of progression. We're seeing storms that slow and stall, and that was much like we saw in Harvey. Those can have implications for rains or storm surge, depending when that stalling occurs. We've also seen rapid intensification, which not only wreaks havoc for evacuation and preparation, but has some serious implications for building resilience. And a good example of this can actually be observed in Hurricane Laura. So in 2020, that storm made landfall and it did rapidly intensify. And unlike many other hurricanes that we would traditionally see, it didn't weaken as quickly as one normally would once it made landfall. The result is what you see in this map here. The color contours from dark red all the way up to that pale blue and darkened blue, those are showing the areas where the wind speeds of this hurricane, and those wind speeds are shown by those red contours that you'll see arcing there around the track. These are coming from the models predicted by ARA after the fact. Those are showing in those colored pockets, the dark red pocket that you can see right here in the middle is an area where the wind speeds of this hurricane actually exceeded the design wind speed in the building codes by at least anywhere up to 10 miles per hour. So as a result, you had storms that were coming inland with such intensity that buildings were being designed for a lesser wind speed, because conventionally we would assume they would weaken by that point, but the actual observed wind speeds were above the design standard. And as a result, then you saw some pretty significant wind losses well inland, particularly in the city of Lake Charles and the surrounding areas. And our drones, for example, captured imagery of one of the more famous catastrophic failures. And this is of the Capital One Tower you can see here. That building was eventually demolished due to the wind losses that were experienced in this storm. So as these hazards are changing in their intensification and the ways in which they landfall, we are seeing differences in the hazards today in our contemporary landscape. But what I also try to remind people is we've also changed our exposure significantly as a country. We have rising population in coastal areas, and that trend cannot be ignored. We also have, increasing concentrations of wealth in those coastal communities. So as we are concentrating more assets and more human lives in our coastal counties, we are indeed seeing some rises then in the exposure that would equally contribute to the losses that I showed earlier in this presentation. Now, again, where people settle matters. And that's why I want to draw your attention to where in our country we're seeing some of the more significant intensifications of climate-driven hazards. And indeed, while sea level rise affects both of our coasts, and drought particularly concentrates west of the Mississippi, the risk of catastrophic flooding, storm surge, and winds associated with hurricanes, convective storms, and other weather-related phenomenon on what we'd call the wet side of the hazard spectrum clearly fall to the east coast or the east side of the Mississippi and have a heavy concentration, particularly in the southeastern United States. So as we have seen this kind of progressive migration of our communities towards the coastal areas, the growth of population in the southeastern United States particularly aligns with some of these changing hazard patterns in our country and can be a major contributor then to the losses that we're seeing. Of course, there is a third variable, though, in explaining why our losses are rising so dramatically, and that brings us to the question of vulnerability. I think one of the best ways to capture the vulnerability of our country is actually to look at our colleagues at IBHS and their Rating the States report. The latest report came out in 2024, so just this year, and it rates the coastal states in our hurricane zones along the Gulf and Atlantic coast on a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is a state who's doing a perfect job, if you will, at adopting and enforcing building codes statewide, and those who are scoring 0 would be doing, sadly, the opposite. And as you can see from the color coding, any state that you see in red is doing a poor job. It is scoring less than 70 on their scale, which means you have a weak environment for regulating construction. And you can see that many of the states that we're going to be talking about today are shown in red are across that Gulf Coast. So as a result, we know that the vulnerability is quite significant geographically in some of the areas seeing the escalation in hazard and the increase in population. Now, what I think is really interesting to remember is that building codes are also not this silver bullet. A lot of times when we talk about how to remedy the vulnerability that we're seeing in areas like housing or buildings more broadly, we just say, well, then fix the codes. And the challenge is that the codes are adopted and enforced on a state or even locality-based level. And there can be challenges with those differing processes across the country. The first issue is that states can lag significantly. So even a good state, shown in light green, of North Carolina with a score of 85, can be a couple code cycles behind the latest model building codes. And as you get mounting pressure associated with the pressure not to update the codes, because that has costs for developers, contractors, and the like, you'll often see pressure then to freeze those codes. And in North Carolina, that even became politicized, where tensions over green building regulations actually caused them to freeze the codes for now a decade. And this actually has now affected the ability of some communities to qualify for federal assistance in the wake of Hurricane Helene. So there are real consequences to the lag in code adoption. The second, and probably more glaring for me, is that codes are not retroactive. So in this picture, captured by one of our drones after Hurricane Irma, I think you see a classic example of the fact that codes work, with the caveat that they work for new construction. Codes in our country, generally speaking, affect new construction or renovations of properties. They don't force you to retrofit older structures. So while the house in the middle here in the Florida Keys did excellent in that event, you'll see the neighbors to either side did not fare as well. And that shows you the consequences of older construction built to earlier editions of the code, or even before a modern code era, and the variable performance that you'll see in those structures. What is an equal challenge in the United States is how slow our inventory rolls over. In some of these Gulf Coast states where the building code conditions can be highly variable, the turnover in the building inventory can be very slow. In many states, it's less than 1% per year. So even if today we were to put the most sweeping, rigorous building codes in place across our country, It would be a very slow process if it only applied to new construction. And as a result, with an aging inventory that turns over very slow, code reforms that only focus on new construction will have very little impact. The third issue that I kind of contemplate as I think as an engineer about how we got here is the fact that we focused on life safety. This is a picture from the Chicago fire, so very close to my neck of the woods. And our modern building codes in America were born out of disasters that took many lives. The Chicago fire, the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. So we set out building codes, rightfully so, at the turn of the century in the 1900s to focus on saving lives. But maybe as we look at that today, we perhaps aimed too low. And I say we aim low because codes still allow losses. And we've increasingly found that codes can actually foster, in today's era, a false sense of security among building owners, especially when we become very effective at evacuation and prediction, at least with weather-related disasters. Now we're facing an uphill battle. How do you get a country that got used to designing for the minimum, life safety, to now think about a more performance-based standard, one that values the function of the structure and its ability to be back online shortly after a damaging event? That is a challenge we're now facing and making a shift. So what I've been trying to do in my research is to understand as an engineer, where did we go wrong? And how do we start working with the owners of these properties to understand what it will take for them to join us in a commitment to getting their vulnerable construction to a more hazard resistant state? So for this, I've been working with colleagues in social science and doing a body of interdisciplinary research to understand this a bit more. And I want to take you through the way these owners are thinking based on some of the surveys we've conducted in states like North Carolina and more recently in Louisiana. The first thing that you'll see in the sequence of slides, darker green colors show very likely, down to darker red, not likely at all. So you'll get a sense of how much they feel positively or negatively about these statements. The first being, did you perceive a threat of a hurricane hitting your community within a particular window? And are you worried in general about hurricanes hitting your community or your area? And you can see from the overwhelming green in these pie charts, their sense is yes, hurricanes are coming. The next chart that I really love, and it helps me feel hopeful as an engineer, is then we ask them, what about these mitigation measures that are common in housing? Which of these do you think is effective in stopping the kind of damage that you're seeing in these events? And you'll see by the shades of green, they overwhelmingly feel positive that these are effective measures, the things that we're peddling, if you will, in the market. There's variability in how effective, but overwhelmingly, they believe that what we have to offer as a technical set of recommendations is indeed effective. So people immediately ask, then why aren't they adopting it? Part of that story often is tagged to the question of affordability. Well, do they believe these things are affordable? And while we've done some more advanced analysis of these communities that I'll be presenting a little later in this talk, I can tell you affordability, when you control for other factors, isn't actually driving their decisions. And this quick chart gives you a sense of why that is in part the case. For the majority of the interventions, minus getting those impact rated windows, they believe, at least over 50%, believe that they're affordable. So it's not necessarily that these are a showstopper in terms of upfront cost. But as we'll see a little bit later, the co-benefits that come with that cost are significantly lagging. Another issue, though, that we see is they also don't think they're vulnerable. And this is the part that creates a big challenge. Because even if you make these affordable, even if you incentivize them to act to upgrade their properties, if they don't think they're going to see catastrophic damage, they're unlikely to act. And as we could see with most households, they're expecting to see roof losses. We're going to lose some shingles. And you can see that in the first column here. That's the dominant perceived vulnerability. Look at what's right next to it, roof to wall connections. Very few respondents actually see that as a very likely scenario for their property. Even though the picture I showed you a few slides ago from the Florida Keys, it definitely shows that the load paths of these buildings are vulnerable. So most households believe a lot of their repairs will be cosmetic, largely associated with the loss of roof cover, and therefore they may not be feeling the drive to make these upgrades without the mandates of a building code forcing them to do so. What we also see in companion research conducted by our colleagues at Flash is that building codes have created an impression that their homes are not vulnerable because they'll say, well, my home was built to the code. It was inspected. And indeed, that was the point at time of sale. But of course, some of these homes now were built in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, well before the modern code era. And so people also need to understand that the code is a living document and doesn't hold for the life of their structure. So we adopted as a country a life safety approach, and that's how we built our building codes and standards. That's the way we asked families to build, and that's the way we also kind of approach then safety netting our construction. And that life safety approach really has some significant implications now for the issue of mounting losses that we're seeing in the United States. So when we think about insurance, as soon as we started seeing as a country a rise in losses with some of the more significant hurricanes, the first things that happened across the Gulf Coast were premium hikes, changes in hurricane deductibles, and eventually withdrawal of coverage or the refusal to underwrite the policy. And this creates a very challenging, vicious cycle. Because what starts to happen is then there's a political pressure to bring that coverage back. So as a result, after Hurricane Andrew, we saw the insurance markets sending the signals that they were seeing the risk and starting to withdraw. And we saw, in response to the growing political pressure, the rise in access to these secondary markets, things like the fair insurance requirement, fair access to insurance requirements, or FAIR, and the beach and windstorm plans. These were all meant to be markets of last resort, but they have become increasingly the markets of primary coverage for most households in these areas. In fact, from 1990, where these plans only insured about 55 billion, they saw a huge increase in coverage around the time of Hurricane Katrina, so that by the time we reached 2010, they were insuring over 1,500% more in terms of monetary value in that brief time period. So they really exploded. And what makes these markets particularly dysfunctional is that they are forced to pool in such a way that they insure only the most high-risk properties and then cap the premiums to a point where actuarially they're not sound. One colleague mentioned in a I think a great analogy, it would be the equivalent to a car auto insurer only insuring 16-year-old drunk drivers. If that's your risk pool that you're sharing across, it's not going to take you very long to go bankrupt. We've done the equivalent in many of our housing markets across the Gulf and Atlantic coast. And now many of these plans are insolvent, and even with reinsurance, they may not weather another storm. In fact, the research conducted in 2016 that I'm citing for some of this suggests that almost all the plans were running deficits and were incurring underwriting losses as a result of this high level of exposure. Certainly in 2020 and 2021, we saw Louisiana see a sharp loss of the private insurance market after its latest round of hurricanes. So you can understand that with life safety approaches not really working well and housing losses mounting, we tried to start messaging the importance of moving beyond life safety. And to this, I'll always celebrate and kind of acknowledge the important work that was done by the National Institute for Building Sciences, or NIBS, in this landmark study that monetized the value of mitigation and their mitigation saves research. The exhaustive cost benefit analyses they ran that looked at everything from the direct losses all the way through to things like PTSD, the burden on claims and assistance systems, all of these indirect costs, including displacement of communities, were all valued in their process and showed some important benefits and payouts. For example, if you see here in the first column for wind, if you just adopt the code in those states where we're not, it's a 10-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. Every dollar spent saves you 10 in avoided losses. If you get your structures above the base flood elevation in a riverine area, 6-to-1 payout, right? And if you get communities to go to Code Plus, where they're designing above the code to something like IBHS's Fortified standard, you get another $5 for every dollar invested. So if we took the time to retrofit 3 million single-family homes in this country, we would be seeing benefits of about 6-to-1 for our country in terms of every dollar spent. These are really compelling numbers. If you saw these odds on a lottery, you might be inclined to go for it. But unfortunately, this isn't the way people are making decisions, and this messaging hasn't really moved the needle. In part, tenants, the owners and occupiers of these properties, they have the most to gain and lose by retrofitting their properties to get to the code or beyond the code. But unfortunately, they really haven't felt compelled to do so. And then other key actors in the landscape, from lenders to developers and communities at large, have mixed incentives to get involved. So, with such a diverse landscape of stakeholders around these important questions, we're really running into an issue now of finding out where to focus our message and where to set the incentives so we can start getting people to credibly act on what we know works: mitigation. And that will bring me now to the idea of, well, what have we learned about where are some of the places where we could have an impact, where we might make progress based on the work that we've done so far across communities through the STEER network. So with that, I wanted to assemble for the back half of my talk a set of just lessons learned. All of these lessons were learned in moving around what I call the learning from disaster loop. It's the idea of collecting field observations, now with the help of the NARI network, with equipment and organizing bodies like STEER, to collect data that we then can feed into ongoing research and development, eventually into translation, that if we play our cards right and do our jobs well, will reach those affected communities and help them build back better from their events. And I focus a lot of my work in this first step. How do we collect those field observations, and how we mobilize the network of STEER to support in that endeavor? So STEER, just for a point of orientation, was founded in 2018 after a pilot in the 2017 hurricane season. We respond to these four primary hazards you see on the slide. We've done 64 events, and if you go to our website, you'll be able to read our over 40 reports and 24 briefings. And in our web-based platform on Fulcrum, we have over 30,000 building assessments, mostly to residential construction, that provide an indication of how these structures are performing under these different hazard events. And you can see kind of the events in the map across the background there. I think one of our biggest breakthroughs in STEER has been the use of our mobile application in Fulcrum. That app has collected those over 30,000 building assessments. And what it's really done for us, it's allowed us to make data collection scalable. Because the app can be downloaded on the App Store, I can push it anywhere in the world, Android or iOS. So when an earthquake hit Haiti in 2021, and the security situation was far too dangerous for our teams to go in, we were able to have local data collectors download this app to their phones, and they were able to collect data on over 12,000 buildings, doing that through their own community networks. And that gave them a reach that was of immediate value to USAID and the World Bank and UN Ops. And I think that's a tremendous example of how these mobile platforms can transform a community's capacity to self-report. And what we learned from that example was the value then of having 12,600 records to examine for a single event. In this case, we were able to mine the 39,000 images that were attached to each of those records and find the bright spots using machine learning. So in this case, in this Haiti earthquake, we were able to detect a certain pattern of bracing in a type of traditional construction called a tekla that was actually performing better than masonry construction, and build the evidence base for bright spots on how to build vernacular construction, traditional housing that actually outperformed more contemporary masonry typologies. Access to this kind of data also lets us build massive windstorm databases here in the United States. So I'll call your attention to this new paper that assembles records from multiple hurricane and tornado events into a single database for use that allows you then to isolate the patterns of damage and where those concentrate in the roof and wall systems under the different storm events, giving us important data not only on where losses are concentrating and the sharp difference in tornado events for the same given wind speed, but then being able to examine how different characteristics of those buildings are actually dictating this performance matrix. And that lets you build more reliable predictive models for how these buildings will perform, knowing the inventory characteristics. And that's let us create improved loss modeling. So now instead of hazard-based fragilities that are generated synthetically from computational simulation for a certain subset of building types, we can actually calibrate new fragility curves based on observations in actual hurricanes. And in the case of Hurricane Michael, by mining these big databases we've generated, it let us show, for example, that the fragilities in hazards actually could be updated to better represent the construction in Panama City and Mexico Beach, and even prove that the Florida Building Code was actually very effective in reducing losses, including a new requirement to retrofit roofs to the latest version of FBC. And those were important moments where we could show empirically the impact of those policies in these communities. So with all this data STEER is generating, I believe we have a lot to learn by mining those over 30,000 records. If there's any takeaway that you would have from today's webinar, it's to go and engage that data. I believe there is much to learn in how we can better understand the factors driving performance. But I'll close today by just showing you a few things that I've taken away, what I have seen in looking at data since 2017 on a number of storm events that have swept across residential inventories, and where I see our efforts to encourage mitigation falling short. The first lesson I have is that we need to get better at messaging today's benefits of retrofitting a building, not tomorrow's consequences. One of the downfalls of the mitigation saves, cost benefit analysis is it's communicating future losses, avoided losses if you act today. The problem is acting today costs you money today. And people think in terms of those concrete costs and not the delayed benefits. And what I really want people to remember is that the cost is incurred today, but the actors making these decisions, they make decisions over very different timescales, not the 50 to 100 years that an engineer uses to think about a building. A good example, as our research group pushed forward revised hazard maps for the flood insurance rate programs of the United States, there was concern when those maps showed the increasing risk to coastal construction in places like New York and New Jersey. Politically, that was very unfavorable. And you can then see the consequence where a political cycle, which is much shorter than a hazard profile's life cycle, suddenly starts to push back on the science behind that risk. And more importantly, when you think about the homeowners, you also realize that in their mind, if they're not going to recoup an investment on a property in the short term, and they have to wait for the hurricane that may happen in the future, not guaranteed, it's really not a savory benefit to cost ratio after all. In fact, when we talked to households and we said, do you feel that making these mitigation investments actually raises the value of your property? They found it to have little to no increase in their property value for most of the mitigation measures studied. So the problem is that homeowners are looking to refinance or sell their property on a scale of a decade. They're not waiting 50 to 100 years for the next event. And if they can't recoup the value of their upfront investment in that time, it's not going to be investments they will make. Our research actually shows through a number of papers, they're not worried about upfront affordability. And it actually didn't even depend on the household income. It depended on the fact of when will I see the reward for my resilience, for my investment. And they simply didn't think avoiding a future loss was really a compelling argument. But those homeowners that saw upticks in their property values said that that actually was the reward that motivated them and will continue to motivate them to invest. Not insurance credits, not avoided losses, because those payouts are too small, too slow, and too uncertain. So real estate is a way that we can actually message a benefit today to avoid disaster tomorrow. The second lesson I'd like to leave you with is we have to stop talking about build back better. It's noble, but we've actually got to start talking about build better before. And when I went into Lake Charles, Louisiana after Hurricane Laura, I can tell you that that was a place that told me immediately why this change in messaging is vital. We can no longer be reactive. And the reason for that was 2020 and 2021 was an important year to signal a change in our world. We were starting to see event sequencing in such rapid succession in the same geographic area that losses were compounding exponentially. You hadn't cleaned up the debris from one event and nevertheless repaired before the next hurricane was hitting. 5 storm events struck for example, Lake Charles area in 18 months. But this was not just isolated there, it was across the country. Multiple storm events on the west and east coast were striking in such rapid successions that communities had no time to rebound. This was the subject of a National Academies report we just released about a month ago, introducing the evidence around the rising toll of compounding disaster and the fact that the only way to stop it is to indeed build better before. And as you read through the case studies from Lake Charles in that report, you'll see a world where Hurricane Laura struck, and then 6 weeks later, Delta, and then the deep freeze of a winter storm, followed by catastrophic spring rains, and then Hurricane Ida. It's a really remarkable sequence where the recovery from Laura was still ongoing as they were repeatedly struck over and over. They called themselves the poster child for compounding disaster. I think they're an important case study to look at to understand how we motivate communities to start getting ahead of the storm because they may not have time to chase it from behind. My third lesson is one that does bring me some pause. I like to champion mitigating and voluntary mitigation by homeowners and other property owners to retrofit construction because of how slow our inventory rolls over and how loose our regulatory system has been in many states. But I am also worried about coastal construction because that's a place where the retrofitting cost benefit ratios become a lot more challenging. I believe in wind, retrofitting is an easier sell. When we're talking about damaging surge and waves, we have more important and challenging conversations to engage. Our work in Hurricane Ian demonstrated that we do have the ability to withstand, these coastal hazards if we effectively use, for example, as shown here, our breakaway walls to ensure that we preserve the living spaces that are elevated and allow the flow to pass through the structure, sacrificing where we need to. And on Estero Island, we saw examples of construction post 2000 where this practice was very effective. We still will have challenges characterizing coastal hazards effectively as we are seeing evolutions in that hazard. And we are also going to have challenges elevating our design standards in such a way that we are ready for the rising risk that are posed by hurricanes in coastal areas. But I'm also increasingly convinced that going higher isn't always going to be the solution, and in many cases won't be. And for that reason, one of the earlier reconnaissance missions I worked on in 2016 in Haiti was a really powerful lesson that I'm glad to see more research on now in America. In this drone image you'll see from Hurricane Matthew on Haiti's coast following that storm, you could see two identical buildings. These are both reinforced concrete with masonry infill. And one of them has all the walls completely destroyed and pounded out. The other lost a very weak roof, and that's a fixable problem. The only difference between these two structures, and the ocean is right here, just off screen above, right beyond the word lesson, is a patch of vegetation. That patch of vegetation could, dissipate some of the energy of what were very strong breaking waves at this particular site. And it led to a series of studies at NSF that looked carefully at the idea of nature-based solutions, in this case, unintentional. They just allowed that vegetation to grow, and it had a dramatic impact in protecting that building from damaging wave action. I think we need to invest more in designing with nature to find ways to protect possibly properties we can't elevate, to give some hope and some option, rather than trying to elevate in cases where it may not be feasible. Lesson 4, I really want our country to start talking about the fact that minimum codes are minimums. And to this, I'd like to show you the Midwest tornado outbreak in 2021, Mayfield, maybe the town you remember from that Christmas time outbreak, really heartbreaking set of tornadoes. New tornado provisions are out in AAC 722, Chapter 32, and they are ideal to guide communities like these in reconstructing after tornadoes. But there's a challenge. The provisions require tornado considerations to be factored in for risk category 3, critical construction, and category 4, essential construction. But there's nothing stopping the owner of a risk category 2, which is most buildings, including residential buildings, from thinking about designing to a higher standard. When will we start communicating their option, their right, to go to a higher risk category voluntarily in the design process? And when making that determination, considering the vulnerability of the occupants. Can they be evacuated? Could they escape? Certainly, some of the properties we looked at, including small scale nursing and assisted living facilities, they didn't classify as critical or essential, but their occupants couldn't safely evacuate. So, don't they warrant then elevation voluntarily to a higher standard? We need to start talking about the fact that minimums are minimums and enforcing maybe a more vulnerability focused design, in this case, not for the building, but for the occupants to consider whether they truly could evacuate and safely be protected in an event like this. And tornado design is very challenging. Being able to secure the load path against high EF class tornadoes may be completely economically infeasible. But another thing that we saw in Mayfield was the performance of storm shelters. There are families, including this woman right here, whose house was completely destroyed in 1988 by a tornado, and she elected to build a safe room in her house. Her house is gone again, but they were alive because of the choice to build a safe room because they knew they couldn't invest in the whole house hardening that would have been necessary. That safe room is home built. What I mean is that's a homemade shelter. It wasn't anything that was compliant with formal standards. It's built of CMU with a concrete slab on top. Another example was prefabricated, a commercial one that was purchased and buried below ground. That one protected 8 people and their 2 dogs in the town of Bremen, Kentucky. The point was these saved lives, and these families made choices based on their own vulnerability and the desire to save their family and even their pets to have these storm shelters at the ready. And I believe that we can start open sourcing designs for these kind of small home shelters that are compliant with the ICC 500 standard, but that give families a suite of sizes, configurations, and price points to add shelters to their homes, because this may be the most cost-effective solution in some of these more tornado-prone areas. The last lesson I want to close with is the idea that we do have to start having very difficult conversations about when it's time to run and when it's time to hide. The old adage is that you can hide from the wind, you need to run from the water. And our evacuation protocols have really been built on that premise. As we're seeing with many of the rapidly intensifying hurricanes and the uncertainty around their tracks, sometimes it's impossible to evacuate the entire community in time for an event. And we've seen a shift in places like Florida through messaging like know your zone, know your home, and even helping households make determinations about whether they are eligible to shelter in place or they should evacuate, knowing that in areas anticipated to be impacted by strong storm surge, evacuation is necessary. But in places further inland, exposed to high winds, the structure's integrity could be an important deciding factor as to whether they can indeed hide. And as we think about this, this is an evolution in an understanding of the relationship between a family, their home, and the hazard. And understanding, especially if they have energy dependencies, vulnerabilities, and evacuating their household members, they can make a more informed decision about how and when to evacuate. And this is kind of a new era. I have heard a number of practitioners say shelter in place may be the norm soon in some of these areas that are harder to evacuate, in which case we would have to think about, again, elevating design standards well above the minimums and even toward Code Plus to ensure these structures could be occupied and even supported sufficiently off grid to allow people to stay sheltered in place safely and comfortably for the duration of that exposure. I know also that there is new messaging around the idea of bringing the feel of coastal living inland through examples like Babcock Ranch, where you can indeed have some of the amenities of water-based living without the immediate exposure to a more hazardous coastal environment and with greater support for off-grid, kind of sustainable functionality. I think we have to start having more honest conversations about whether it is indeed too dangerous to continue living and developing some coastal areas. And I appreciate and have a tremendous heartbreak in small island nations when these painful conversations begin to happen. But as an engineer, we will hit physical and economic limits that may only be, managed through managed retreat. And these are not easy conversations, but I feel they'll be increasingly necessary. And sometimes engineers will have to have the courage to say, no, we shouldn't develop there, and start instead thinking about alternatives that help communities find a safer alternative. So my big takeaways for today, losses are globally mounting, and particularly in the United States. But we have to remember it is an important and complicated trifecta of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability that have brought us to this moment. Our policies, our behaviors, and even our very design philosophy as engineers did contribute to where we are today. Fundamentally, we have to start rethinking how we build and where we build. We need to understand incentives and how to use them to affect human behavior. We also have to understand when we've created perverse incentives that have allowed people to stay perhaps too long in areas of too high of a risk. If we are going to change their behaviors, we also will need to then start thinking about the 5 lessons I shared today. How do we message the need to change? I don't think it's avoided losses. People need to hear co-benefits in the short term, ideally today, if they're going to act for tomorrow. Second, we are in a new era of compounding losses, and really my eyes were opened in Lake Charles to this reality. It's time to start talking about build better before. We simply may not be able to wait to build better, build back better afterward. We need to design with nature. I am so inspired by the work of colleagues working on nature-based solutions. I want to see more of that and more evaluation of nature-based solutions by communities. I think it can be one of the important tools in our toolbox to keep coastal communities safe. But I also want to start reminding us that when we communicate to building owners, we need to remember code minimums are minimums. And it's time to start talking about the vulnerability of occupants and functional recovery objectives and performance objectives beyond life safety, because you can always go higher than the minimum. No one is ever stopping you. It's time to have those conversations. And as those conversations happen, there will be days again where, again, the physics just tell us we may not be able to predict what's coming in the next 50 to 100 years. And it may be more important to have a better conversation about the time to hide, the time to retreat, the time to develop in completely new areas. Because again, as an engineer, predicting what's coming in 50 to 100 years is a daunting prospect. So with that, I acknowledge our sources of funding, particularly from the National Science Foundation, our many wonderful collaborators, both within the NARI network and beyond. And I will open the floor up to conversation and questions.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and a virtual round of applause from everyone. That was such a illuminating and just fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And we've been getting a ton of questions, so I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but definitely some of them. So feel free to keep adding questions, and I'm happy to share those with Tracy after we get off, and maybe she can let you know what the answers to your questions are later.
Yes, definitely.
So we had a question from David Bonowitz. He said, NEHRP is on the path to reauthorization with new emphasis on resilience, functional recovery, and retrofit. Bipartisan, but still needs House approval. Do you have specific recommendations for the National Wind Program related to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we've had some really great conversations with the Climate Solutions Caucus, both in House and Senate. And there is a lot of renewed attention on both sides of the aisle. That's one thing I'll say, bipartisan support, because what we found is that everyone sees the toll this is having on communities. So a couple of the recommendations that we've shared our research, first of all, we've shown that if we can, for example, and I look at what happened in California with soft story retrofitting, right? There was a requirement to retrofit, but compliance is still a challenge. So we know that incentives, they can be carrots or sticks, right? I'm very much a fan of carrots. So one of the things I've been encouraging is that we would love to see greater incentivization of valuation in real estate markets for proactive resilience building measures. I know there is hesitancy to have, let's say, real estate listings show some kind of rating system. Like, I'm not advocating for a lead, because the fear is if it's mandated on all listings and a house is vulnerable, then you plunge the value, and I understand the implications. But could we show it as a plus up? Meaning when it does have those features, they can be showcased in some way. Oh, the soft story compliance. Maybe I can come back to that one. My colleagues have informed me, but perhaps I'm mistaken, that they still never got 100% compliance in residential for soft story in some of the municipalities. That was what I was informed. If I'm mistaken and you can clarify in the chat, please do. But perhaps what I can say, and maybe this is a better corollary, California is a very strong regulatory environment. I showed you states across the Gulf Coast that can't even enforce a building code right now. So I don't have the same hope. When I look at what California did, and even the fact that they never got 100% in some locations, I have less optimism in other coastlines. So maybe that is a better qualifier. And if I'm mistaken that they got to 100% and I was at the wrong meeting, yeah, California is very different. So putting that aside, I want to see greater incentives, particularly in the real estate market, to communicate in disclosures, to value in appraisals, and to list housing that is meeting particular resilience standards as a plus, rather than a kind of blanket requirement that would unfortunately highlight negative performing properties, if you will, and reduce their values. That's the problem we've had with resilience rating scales on the East Coast. And so we have to stay away from that. So those are some of the things we're talking about, and they are, I think, honestly, looking at the role of insurance in this. That was the second recommendation, and how we could tie mitigation investment more intentionally to insurance. And I know there's a lot of conversation about that kind of reform happening nationwide, not just in the hurricane affected states.
Thank you. All right, we had a question from Calla Fleming who asked, how is consensus on rebuilding after disasters evolving? And then she mentioned, there's issues with lower income communities or homes that have less, overall value, and how are we thinking about like the economic benefits of places that may technically not be worth as much, but still are housing the same number of people, and how are we prioritizing that in terms of rebuilding?
Yeah, I think this is one that we had, and I'll particularly highlight in the work we were doing in Lake Charles. They are viewing their sequence of events, as traumatic as those were, as a reset on affordable housing, but affordable resilient housing. There was a real understanding that if we don't tackle the affordable housing dilemma in our country by looking at affordable resilient housing, we're going to keep going in these kind of generational backsliding every time there's a disaster event. So I think no one has an easy answer for this, and the cost of housing is making this complicated. However, the measures that we're talking about here, they don't require significant investment or increase in the cost of construction when they're done as part of new construction. So that would be my point of advocacy. If we can start mainstreaming, they've had some success in Alabama, for example, fortified construction standards, even into housing programs that are led at the state or federal level for low-income properties. The incremental increase in cost that you get for the benefit of those communities who are the least able to absorb the shock and recover, and are the most vulnerable if they were to be displaced from their economic livelihoods and other important assets, it's worth the investment. And so I think they're thinking about this more just because of the very harsh experience they had. And they want to be an example for other Gulf Coast states. And I'm really hopeful and anxious to see how they do. But their recovery money just arrived within the last year. So they do have quite a journey ahead of them to actually prove this out.
Thank you. This next question is from Danrong Zhang, and they say, I am planning to rebuild my house, which was damaged by Milton, but I'm concerned that even if I build it to the current code, I will need to make frequent investments to keep it up to date as codes evolve, especially with the accelerating impacts of climate change. From a resilience perspective, it feels like simply following the current code may not be enough. What should I consider to make my house more future-proof?
Well, I mean, certainly that's the dilemma we're all facing, is we can't predict the future. So I think that is the first and most important. The second is understanding the nature of your risk. And so whether that damage came from inland flooding versus, coastal damage, wind damage is an important consideration. But my takeaway to most owners is to go Code Plus from the outset. Look at IBH fortified standards, see which of the tiers you find approachable as a price point. And you said Milton, but I wasn't sure what state. Some states have incentive programs, probably Florida, if you're Milton, for going to Code Plus and to bringing to that standard. So that's where I would start, is at least to go to Code Plus. But for inland flooding, it's a much more complicated factor, because that has to do with, stormwater management, which is often beyond the sole control of the homeowner, even though you could waterproof and water barrier. But I'd start with fortified. I'd always go put Code Plus. And I did so for my own house here in Indiana. I went Code Plus.
Awesome. Thank you for that suggestion. Let me look through. We have a bunch of questions here, so let me just peruse them and see which one we want to tackle next. Okay, so Emily Embleton said, how do we balance prioritizing nature-based solutions with some of the issues around destruction of nature that accompanies infrastructure expansion and degradation from rebuilding? So how do you balance both of those things?
I think, ultimately, there's not going to be an elegant answer to this, but what I think it reminds me of is the importance of integrated design. I think so much of our design process had been historically siloed. Like, I build this building in isolation, I make this decision in isolation. And while this might not be the direct answer to your question, you actually give me an entree to a more important point. One of the other issues that we raised to the Climate Solutions Caucus and Senate was the idea that many decisions, in fact, all decisions often are local. Municipalities are managing their floodplains with limited tools and knowledge and making decisions for their community that actually might propagate flood risk and enhance it for neighboring communities up and downstream or up and down coast. So the ability to have tools that allow you to do integrated planning with two important scales. One, seeing the regional effect of decisions made, as well as seeing the temporal consequence of those decisions over time. That was another thing that we were encouraging. There are a number of platforms that could actually be democratized, if you will, to give access to local planners who don't have those in-house to see consequences of decisions. So to your point on nature-based, more integrated design actually looks at the harmonization between land use planning, individualized, site development, but that's part of a larger regional planning strategy that's considering those effects. And I think we partition and silo too much of what we do, both disciplinarily, locally, and from an integration of nature and man-made systems. And I'd like to see us do more integrated design, because I think honestly, that's the only hope we have to stop some of these unintended consequences we create when we silo the design process.
Thank you. Let's see, we have maybe time for one more question. So John Ingardiola said the IBC requires new schools and first responder facilities to be equipped with tornado storm shelters in Tornado Alley. Why are some of the Tornado Alley states deleting that from their adopt minimum building code? What is needed to reverse this weakening?
Oh, yeah. If I could unpack the many reasons why people, I mean, realistically, I know that, and this was another factor that came up in the Gulf Coast, so I'll tell you what they were saying. Their budgets don't have the funding that's flexible enough for them to do some of this work, and they complain that the mitigation programs, grant programs, et cetera, have too many hoops to jump through, and they just don't have the ability to secure the funds to do a lot of what they want to do. Interestingly, when COVID hit in Louisiana, all this American Rescue Plan and relief funding came in for COVID kind of assistance and an economic reboot, and it didn't have strings attached. And they were able to use that money then to upgrade and retrofit and address deficiencies in their infrastructure. It was an important lesson to me that communities know what they need, but they always don't have the flexibility in their budget to actually address those needs. And having some less encumbered financing mechanisms that they could use to retrofit would actually be probably a huge benefit. So I am wondering, are these driven, without knowing these communities, by economic considerations and lack of available budget? Number two, are they driven by the displacement that could happen in the school, in disruption of educational continuity if they had to, do the retrofit? I'm sure there's a number of factors, but if we can make it easier for communities to finance and access the funding to make these good decisions, I think that could help based on what I saw in Louisiana and what it took for them to rebound after their 5 storms.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I will share them with Tracy afterwards. I just have a couple announcements here before we part. But I do want to just offer so much gratitude towards Tracy and whoever else contributed to these efforts that she presented on today. We also want to thank FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. We are so grateful to everyone who joined. It was such a great turnout, and we're so glad you were all here from the many different places around the world. So before we close, I just have a couple announcements. So remember, if you did attend the webinar today and want continuing education credits, go ahead and contact us at hazardcenter@colorado.edu. Those are generously offered through IAEM. Additionally, please save the date for our next webinar, which is going to be in the new year in January 21st. And we're going to have a group of folks from the Association of Continuity Professionals discussing how they work in parallel with emergency management officials to plan for disruptive events. We also hope you will go ahead and subscribe to updates through the Natural Hazard Center website so you can receive notifications about upcoming webinars and other free resources and information. So go to hazards.colorado.edu/sign up, and we will have some big announcements regarding our workshop coming out very soon. So if you're interested in attending, it's our 50th anniversary this year and you don't want to miss it. So now, on behalf of our entire team at the Natural Hazard Center, I want to thank you again and thank Tracy for the wonderful presentation, as well as everyone who joined today. And we look forward to seeing you in January.
And thanks, Carson. If you want to send along any questions that you snagged that we didn't get to, I'm happy to write them up and you can share them back out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracy.
All right. Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.